It's election season in Armenia. Break out your beer and popcorn, or ponchiks and piroshkis, and sit down for conversations on Groong. It'll be fun for the entire family. Mikael Darbinian is a political scientist and former U.S. diplomat, having served at the U.S. embassies in Argentina and Russia as vice consul. He's currently serving as a security advisor for the Strong Armenia party, and he joins us today for an interesting conversation about those issues.
And very quickly, please make sure you're subscribed, like, comment, and share so that we can expand our reach. We really appreciate any support you can give. And thank you. On with the show.
Mikael Darbinian, welcome to the Groong podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Mr. Darbinian.
Mr. Darbinian, this is your first time on our show, so it's traditional for us to ask you, please tell us a little thing or two about yourself, your work, your interests, your background, so that our listeners can get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on the show. I follow you guys as well. I know a lot of Armenians follow you guys. You have a really big audience, so I'm one of them. It's good to finally see you guys face to face, not in person, but so yeah, I'm a former US diplomat. I served in Argentina as a vice consul and in Russia as a vice consul between like the whole year of 2023 and 2024. In Argentina, the whole COVID crisis time, 2021, 2022. I've worked for three different governments, the Spanish, the Armenian, and the US governments in four different diplomatic missions. It was basically a consular. So I've been in a lot of consular missions. In Argentina, for example, I was issuing visas during that time, lots of visas, tourist visas, study visas, things like that. While in Russia, it was a different case because it was at the height of the US-Russia diplomatic crisis. We didn't have enough staff. We weren't issuing visas. So it was basically just looking after US citizens, ACS, American Citizenship Services, going to visiting US prisoners in prisons, attending trials, different things, renewing passports and things like that. In LA, I lived in LA as well, and I worked at the Spanish consulate in LA, also on visas, but giving Schengen visas, as a vice head of the visa department there. And then I worked at the Armenian embassy in Madrid. I lived in Spain for about 10 years. I studied there at the Complutense University. So I have a bachelor's in political science, and then my master's I did at the same university. And in international relations, I lived in Artsakh in Nagorno-Karabakh. I worked for the Halo Trust. If you guys know the Halo Trust, it was a humanitarian NGO from UK, would basically clean and dispose of unexploded ordnance, mines, shells, things like that. So that was probably one of the most rewarding jobs for me. I was able to visit almost everywhere in NK. Villages, speak with villagers. I used to do interviews with them. So.
Okay, Mikhail, I'm just very, very interested in your background, and you were in Russia and all these other missions at some very critical times. Do you have any interesting anecdotes or episodes that you can share with us?
And look, in Russia, I'll tell you this. Diplomacy tends to be reciprocal. So one side does one thing, the other side does a reciprocal thing. So when I first was assigned to Russia, when we walked in Russia, it was, what day was it? It was in January. It was in January 2023. It was dead winter. It was probably minus 15 centigrade outside. I walked into the consulate. It looked like a ghost town, a complete ghost town. It was a huge consulate. Normally, but look, it's open source information. I can say this. Normally, the embassy would staff about 1,000, 1,100 employees, diplomats, different types of support staff. But we had about, I don't know, maybe 10% of that, about 100, 150. So it had gone down because of the bilateral crisis and the US limiting Russian diplomats and Russia limiting US diplomats tit for tat. It was like a ghost town. So I walked in, it was a huge consulate with computers, everything. But there's no one. It was dead quiet. It got scary. It would get scary at moments because it's you're waiting for someone to go there, and you walk into some of the rooms sometimes and you just see Coca-Cola sitting there where the people just left it, who knows when, like a year or two before that. You see, I don't know, someone's handwriting on a piece of paper that they were taking notes about something that they just left. So that was kind of eerie. It was kind of strange because uh, it's probably one of the most observed areas in the world. Same with the Russian embassy in the US, or the US embassy in China. The US embassy in Russia is probably one of the most third or fourth most observed areas in the world in terms of intelligence and things like that. I mean, I can't go into those details, but in any case, it was kind of strange at first because you're going into a country where you represent a country that's the adversary of where you are. And it's kind of weird, you walk into a store and, luckily I wasn't really taken as an American, a typical American, because I speak Russian as well. So it was a lot easier for me. But it was kind of weird just walking into sometimes these places. I went to Vladivostok a couple of times for a hearing and just walking normally in the streets. I mean, people there, they have no idea who you are. They don't know you're a US diplomat. What's a US diplomat doing in Vladivostok? And yeah, just speaking to normal people and as a normal person. Not everyone could do that, obviously, because I speak Russian. That's why. It was a bit similar to I lived in Turkey as well. After my student years, I was interested in kind of assessing how Turkey is. And I went there as well as an Armenian, and that was kind of similar to that, where you're an Armenian, you're in Turkey, and everyone around you is Turkish. Uh, at first, it was kind of a strange feeling, like if these guys knew I was Armenian, what would they do? Or if these guys knew I was, the U.S. diplomat, what would they do? But I think you adjust quickly. So I think that's in general. I think it's always good to be able to adjust to the situation and put it behind you and play it cool.
So, with this present level of experience, you would expect that Mikael Darbinian is 75 years old. uh,
Were you there
so,
for the prisoner exchange for Paul Whelan's exchange?
So yeah, I was there. It was 2024, I believe. Yeah. I was there. I had, my small contribution to it as a consular officer. It was Erin Gershkovich, it was Paul Whelan, and also Kurmasheva. These three were U.S. citizens, and I mean, as a consular officer as well, I would visit them in prison. Also, I've been to her hearing, but I hadn't seen her in prison. To Paul Whelan, I'd visited,
Wow.
with the ambassador as well and things like that. So I got to know him. I mean, as much as you can know from the other side of the window. And I'll open up something. I used to actually prepare his care packages. His family would send care packages, and I would package it up, and personally walk it out to
Wow.
the post office to send it to him because had major staffing gaps. We had no one to do it. We had to do those types of things. So, and I was kind of the youngest, maybe the strongest, let's say. I was doing that mainly. But Whelan, yeah,
So,
Aaron Gershkovich as well. I met him a couple times, and
wow. So here you are, and now you're a you're a consultant, a security consultant for the Strong Armenia party that is participating in these upcoming elections. That's great. Can you tell us a little bit about your role exactly? What is your role in the security team? Well, I think you're an advisor to the security team for Strong Armenia. Tell us a little bit more about that.
yeah. So, just to clarify from the start, I myself, I'm not a member of the party. I'm an independent, like, security advisor. Security in the sense of not physical security of people there, but formulating a security concept because all parties, all governments, and all parties, they have to have their own program, right? Like they have their security program, the economic program, what they want to achieve, what type of economic goals they want to achieve, what social programs they want to bring for the citizens, and security-wise as well. How you want to build up the armed forces and things like that, deterrence capabilities. I'll go into that as well, but so I'm part of the security campaign security advisor alongside a couple other people, Artur Avanesian, Kandas, his nickname.
Who's currently in jail. Yeah.
Yeah. We're actually it's kind of a hard time because I worked alongside him for so much time and literally seeing the same guy, and all of a sudden he's not there. So, but Artur Avanesian is an excellent person to work with. I've very easygoing, direct. It's yeah. So I'm alongside him. I'm alongside. We have two others, foreigners as well. A Greek ex-special forces officer, Eftimis Turtidis. He's very tactical as well, but he's also in on the operational scale. And we also have the former head of the Israeli anti-air defenses, Tzvika Khaimovich. They're outside, but they're also consultants when needed to formulate the security concept. So my role here is because of my background, academic and diplomatic background, I contribute to, I formulate, for example, foreign policy and deterrence related to that. Not just
Yeah.
foreign policy, because we have experts, we have Armenian local experts for Armenian foreign policy and things like that. But as for like deterrence and security wise, I contribute to that. What you have to kind of focus on overall security, if it's energy security, if it's food security, infrastructure, you have to take all of that into consideration. And I'm also a risk analyst, sorry. I work as
Yeah.
an OSINT analyst. I've done so for different companies, and so as a risk assessment, carrying out risk assessment, you have to consider everything, not just military, but you have to consider, if a road is blocked, are you going to have another road? Do you want to put in the program that you guys are going to build a
Yeah.
few more roads, things like that.
Yeah.
So
And in fact, that's how I was watching the security presentation by Strong Armenia, and that's how I first learned about you. In that presentation, you said, and I'm trying to quote, no lasting peace is possible without a stable and developed national security system, strong
system, yeah.
armed forces, and a skilled diplomacy. Um, Tell us more about your understanding of that statement and also how your background, uh, plays into that.
Yeah, exactly. That was the 18th of March, I remember, the start of our security program. So, strong armed forces and skilled diplomacy, that speaks of deterrence. So, every country has to have some type of deterrence. Deterrence can be considered like a means of persuading an adversary of not doing something that can harm you, broadly speaking. You have an adversary, you have Azerbaijan, you have, this or that country. You want to persuade that country or dissuade that country so they don't attack you. You can do that through military means. You can do that through diplomatic means if you have really good, alliances. If you have, Russia, EU, China, India, very broadly speaking, very to make it very simple, you call the head of India's head of state. You say, hey, can you speak to my neighbor? He's trying to threaten me. Or you call, the European or Russian head of state and say, hey, my neighbor's amassing troops on the border. Tell him that he shouldn't be doing that. Broadly speaking, and very simply, this can be diplomatic, for example. This can be considered diplomatic deterrence, having really good ties with, big powers that can affect the outcome, that can actually
Yeah.
dissuade. That can also, you can also use lobby groups in the US. I mean, it's very big, obviously, lobby groups, pro-Israeli lobby, arms lobby, pro-Armenian lobby. You have that as well. That kind of can fit into that as well. You can make use of these types of groups to persuade a government to then talk to another government, the adversary, to not carry out, So deterrence normally has the diplomatic aspect, but it also has a military aspect. And Karl von Clausewitz, one of the major military historians and theoreticians, he said, and it's not only him; it kind of follows a logic as well. When diplomacy breaks down, you resort to armed conflict, and so deterrence has diplomacy, and it also has the military. So if for some reason through diplomatic measures your colleagues can't call them, you have the military might. you have anti-air defense, you have ballistic missiles, you have prepared troops to go and actually, either punish or deny the adversary of being able to carry out what he wants to carry out. There's one other aspect of deterrence, but it doesn't really relate to Armenia because you have to be a big power to have it. That's economic. Sanctions. The US has that, for example, also has, I consider the economic aspect of deterrence as very valid for the US because it can sanction other countries and persuade them or dissuade them to not do something. It doesn't always
Yeah.
work. Many times it doesn't, but it's one of the tools that they have. In my background, in this sense, so since my student years, I've besides just reading as a hobby and my master's thesis, I wrote it on the US Russian foreign policy confrontation in the South Caucasus. This was 2015, 2016. And eventually, mm, I thought that eventually these two can come to a clash. If there's no other force, eventually they may come to a foreign policy clash. It doesn't mean military, but it seems like things have kind of changed with a different variable now with Ukraine because US kind of went to Ukraine, the Europeans. It's kind of a long thing in this sense, but my experience in that in foreign policy and deterrence comes from my
Yeah.
my education, my master's thesis, also working at the embassies because I saw how diplomacy works. How you call colleagues, you call counterparts from different countries. You sit down, you talk. One says this, one says that. So I can't really open that one up too much, but from my experience in that, I can see that having really good counterparts, countries,
Yeah.
alongside you helps.
One more question about this security team that Samuel Karapetyan has. Uh, Obviously, we're talking about advisors. There's you, former U.S. Vice Consul. There's the Israeli General Haimovich. There is a Greek, Greece is part of NATO. There is a Greek military person. And then there's Gandas. So, I mean, there's this perception that Samuel Karapetyan's team is very pro-Russia, but it seems like he has been able to gather a very non-pro-Russian team. So, or I mean, at least based on the background of the people involved. So, how did that come about?
Well, it just kind of breaks the myth of him being pro Russia because I mean, yeah, he always has capital in Russia, but he has capital in Greece, he has capital in other parts of Europe, in the UAE as well. So it's not just having capital in Russia, but so that it breaks the myth right there. That's what many
Yeah,
people say. Many people don't know that, but he has capital around the world. And second, his main I'm kind of quoting him. I may be missing a couple words, but Samuel Karapetyan basically said, Armenia has no right to be on bad terms with any global power. And so, I mean, I think he, as a businessman, self-made businessman, he's been able to see a lot of things that I personally haven't seen, or others that, if they haven't been in that position, they hadn't seen. But I think he kind of bases himself on the logic of being on good terms with different countries and not depending just on one country. That's actually
right.
the party's one of the main focuses for the party, and especially in terms of security that we're in, is don't rely only on one security guarantor. Russia is great to have, but also US, but also China, but also Iran, but also EU. I mean, see if you can, create several different security partners, and that way you're not dependent on only one. If something breaks down, if for some reason, one of the security partners is tied up or for some reason can't help, you don't stay alone
Yeah.
and, face the challenges.
So, in the current environment, I mean, the current regime essentially, I think, has managed to degrade Armenia's status diplomatically and strategically, almost with anyone involved. Even with the EU, I think Armenia is at a position of an alms seeker trying to get, like, anything it can. In terms of the Armenian society, when you ask the Armenian society who should Armenia be partners with, there was this MPG poll. Half of them said, you'll find an equal number of answers almost. Some said EU, some said Russia, some said US. So there is no, I think, alignment in terms of the public on foreign policy related to security. I'm not even talking about Armenia diaspora relations, which I would think are very important security. But in your speech, you called for a mobilization. Like this, you said that this is an Armenia's Pearl Harbor moment, and we need to mobilize our national potential. Do we have any potential left after Pashinyan that we can mobilize, assuming that the opposition can come to power?
Yeah, and on this end, maybe it'll be more correct for me to speak for myself and not as not for the party. Although there may be overlaps there, but speaking on behalf of myself only, there is potential. I see potential, and actually, I think the party also sees potential in that in lots of people, and so in speaking about on my behalf, potential, we have lots of educated people. We have really good diplomats here. Honestly, I've met people here that just blow you away. It's tremendous. It's incredible. People, for example, with Middle Eastern studies or former diplomats or this or that or sociologists that have years of experience, and you talk to them, and you wonder how we have so much potential. There are lots of experienced people here, but they're not being used. They're not being used to do what they like to do. So I think Pashinyan and his government is not about that. He's about putting, we've, at least what I've seen, is assigning people loyal to him to maintain basically his rule, his power in different security ministries or this and that ministry. So I don't see him making any use of this potential, and I know lots of people that would simply not collaborate with him, and that's a huge loss. And that's why I think, personally speaking, the 7th of June, he has to go. Through elections, he's gone through. The Armenia has seen lots of failures with him, and I think
he's a very divisive person. I agree.
Yeah.
Mikael, what is the role of the diaspora in this national potential that you see?
There's a lot. We have so members of the diaspora from LA to Moscow to Spain to Argentina, for example, experts, lots of experts there, people that bring different ways of thinking that here in Armenia, it's a bit different. Armenia, it's a small country, and not everyone is able to go out and travel or, work alongside French people, Russians, or Americans, or, different. And I think you learn a lot from working with different people, and what the diaspora can bring is innovation in a sense of new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, new relations, for example, marketing, economy, technology, just broadly speaking, new ways of thinking. I think that would be a huge potential for Armenia to be able to enrich what we have, or what Armenian society has now. I think it's fundamental, actually, for the diaspora to be able to contribute to further development of all of this.
I want to talk about the sovereign territory of Armenia that's been invaded since 2021. Approximately 252 square kilometers of Armenia's territory proper has been invaded, essentially, including critical heights that give Azerbaijan fire control over Armenian villages and infrastructure. Your analysis shows a staggering amount of sovereign territory is currently occupied. Can you walk us through the strategic implications of the 103, I think you have said, Azerbaijani positions currently inside our borders?
Approximately, yeah. So we know that after the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, the Pashinyan government ceded Kelbajar and the Lachin area. Actually, Lachin, some of Lachin was already taken militarily, but ceded Kelbajar, Karvajar, to the Azeri side without a shot being fired. He ceded that territory, which is right next to Gerarkunik. Sot, the biggest gold mine in the South Caucasus, was, under Armenia's
Right there.
controls inside Armenia. Yeah, yeah. So Karvajar is right along Gerarkunik and other villages as well. And as he ceded that territory, he ceded that in November of officially, yeah, it was November of 2020.
Yeah,
And there's lots of
Monte's birthday.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
Monte
that's true.
Melkonian's birthday, I think November 25th.
Yeah, it did coincide. Now that you say it did coincide. So he ceded those territories. There's lots of snow because the majority, a good portion of those heights there are about 3,000 meters above sea level. 2,500, 3,000 meters above sea level. That's very high. And there's lots of snow that melts only in May. So it was seeded in November in 2020, and spring comes the next year, late April, early May, and Azeris, they wait for the snow to melt, and they just walk, in some areas, literally just walked into Armenian territory and just, pitched a tent and a military position, and that's all, without any resistance. The issue here was, again, another failure by the Pashinyan government. They did not secure any border positions. I mean, knowingly having, ceded these territories to Azerbaijan, eventually, you're gonna have an issue like that there, where they're gonna walk up on the border. He did absolutely nothing, and just soldiers with a small trench dug up by themselves with a shovel, standing in the middle of nothing, with literally nothing, no tents in some areas, no tents, no fortifications, absolutely nothing. So it was ceded, and Azerbaijan slowly came in. In some areas they just walked across the border and stayed along those heights. In other areas there were clashes. I think you guys saw my presentation then, on the 25th of March it was. So in 2021, 2022, and 2023, there was a series of clashes, border clashes, about 5 or 6 a year. A lot happened. If we consider a border clash like a 1 day, 2 day occurrence or more, there's numerous that happened. So throughout the years, Azerbaijan basically slowly invaded in some areas, just walking across or shoving, pushing, Armenian soldiers. Armenian soldiers, they weren't able to, from what I've seen and from what I've heard, they weren't able to respond because they had orders not to respond, not
That's
to
right.
shoot, not to, yeah. And there comes the September 2022. September 2022, Azerbaijan invaded. It was a 2 day invasion. It seems like nothing, for a country like the US or Russia, which, big powers are involved in armed conflicts. But for Armenia, 2 days is big. They're able to, in these 2 days, they're able to break Armenian defenses, which were minimal. And yeah, come to acquire 80 square kilometers just outside of Jermuk. And the 252 square kilometers that I measured, it's the territory between border posts, military positions, sorry. So it's the midpoint between two military positions. If you actually count, up to the Armenian military position, it's even more. Because in any case, it's rendered useless, this land, because you can't even use this. I'll get into that. I'll tell you guys a story in a second as well. But so basically, how did Azerbaijan come to, gain, to occupy 252 square kilometers? Armenia's government basically did nothing after the 2020 NK war. No borders, no fortifications, no mobilization, nothing, and just ceding one after another.
And they lied about this, by the way, to the people, because they said that they had fortifications. They said they had the border guards and everything, but they didn't.
Yeah, it's bad. It's actually really bad. Even now, you have a lot of border positions that I mean, that's not where you
Well,
want to
there are reports.
look.
I'm citing 168 that say that for some positions, Armenian soldiers have to actually be allowed to go to their post and come back through Azeri military. I don't know if they frisk them or whatever, but this is it's ridiculous.
In a
But that
couple
is a
areas, yeah, I think. I think
yeah.
in the Klavush area, for example, and maybe in Sunik.
Mikael, I
Yeah.
don't mean to interrupt, but what's the plan to deal with this invasion of our territory?
What's the plan? The party's plan or a general plan?
A general
Because
plan
Both.
of strong Armenians to deal with this, you know, issue.
yeah. So look, Strong Armenia, the whole the security concept of it is defensive. It's not offensive, because Armenia is a small country in itself, and even having Azerbaijan next door, Azerbaijan has very strong diplomatic ties with lots of countries, has a huge GDP, lots of income. It has, the latest technology in arms that Armenia's stayed behind these past, several years. Uh, and so, militarily speaking, I think the party is tilting more towards diplomatic means, having good allies. I mean, it's obviously having really good partners and finding new partners is fundamental for the party. That's actually part of the plan as well. Not strengthen, but recover our relations with some of our partners because they've gone really sour. Recover our relations with some of our partners, find new partners, maybe in Latin America, maybe in Asia, and in general have, for example, major powers, US, Russia, who are, still kind of negotiating over the Ukraine. Why can't they negotiate over Armenia? You had the Minsk group. It was the US, Russia, and France. Obviously, it's a bit different now, but nonetheless, major powers, all countries have their interests. So I think part of the plan is that converge different powers and converge different powers that have overlapping interests in the region, so they kind of boost security and through negotiations come to the eventual result of that.
Yeah. I mean, I strongly agree with that. And the fact is that if the Armenian government says, this border post is not really important for us, this church in Stepanakert, we're not going to say anything about it, I think foreign powers are elated because there's no pressure on them to do anything.
Yeah.
The number one point, the primary defender has to be Armenia, trying to state that those are red lines, those are important for Armenia, and then foreign governments some will follow, others won't. But when you have an Armenian government that is capitulating, then it actually
Yeah.
removes the burden on anyone else to why should Spain or why should China spoil its relations with Azerbaijan if the Armenian government is actually basically echoing Aliyev's words. But
Yeah.
I think even
I want to
Russians
move
said
us,
we can't be more Armenian than Armenia.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. You mentioned red
uh,
lines. Sorry, Hovik, I just want to mention this one really
yeah,
quickly. You mentioned red lines, and actually part of the foreign policy as well for deterrence, because deterrence, as we mentioned, has the foreign policy, has diplomatic, and it has a military. One of those is red lines. A foreign policy with red lines, which we don't see right now, but that's what the party wants to bring. Red lines, non-negotiable. To have alongside that, strong military to
yeah,
speak from a position of power as well.
yeah. I want to move us forward to this idea of the TRIPP, which Pashinyan, Trump route for international peace and prosperity.
Mhm.
The Azerbaijanis call it the Zangezur Corridor. You know, Pashinyan is pitching this as a regional connectivity solution, and everyone is echoing that again because why should the Russian government say, "Hey, I know you're implementing regional connectivity, but it's only east-west. How are you going to connect to us? How are you going to connect to Russia, to Iran? No one is saying anything about that. And you argue that I think diplomacy is works when the homeland is strong. And I'm gonna read another quote from one of your speeches. You said only the balance of strong armed forces and skilled diplomacy can help create effective deterrent mechanisms. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And especially in the light of transforming this corridor, TRIPP, um, from the Zangezur Corridor, what I think the Turks perceive it as, to a real regional connectivity solution. And
Yeah.
how, like,
So
and also, sorry, and how this differs from some of the other opposition ideas. For instance, Robert Kocharian also has similar ideas, but I think on record, Samet Karapetyan has been the most um, open in accepting TRIPP, but saying that security guarantees have to be negotiated into it.
yeah. So I think one thing that stands out about the Strong Armenia Party and in general their program is that uh, they're working off what they're going to inherit. I mean, it's always good to have plans and everything, but they know that they're gonna be inheriting this whole mess, if you want to say, all these challenges, all these difficulties. So I think based off of that, considering if the TRIPP is further elaborated through bilateral agreements between the US and Armenia, I doubt it. I think it's going to take a lot longer. But basically, Strong Armenia Party wants to incorporate, wouldn't be against incorporating different world powers, different powers in that to maintain a balance. So it's not only, US, because if it's only the US, you have Iran there as well. Iran's also an important trade partner for Armenia, and it's the only border that's really open besides Georgia. So and you don't want to not consider the interests of Iran, who's your neighbor. You just can't do it. You live in this neighborhood. You live in this neighborhood. You can't go stepping on people's toes like that. It just makes things worse for you. So I think what the party is generally seeking is broadening this, and that when you look at the actual the TRIPP agreement, it's not finalized, obviously, because if you look, it said, Armenia is expected, it's foreseen, this and that. So the TRIPP that was published, the document that was published in February is still not completed. It's going to take, I assume it's going to take, a year or two to actually finalize, iron out all the issues there. But so you have one of the exclusive rights that's given to the US by the Armenian government is to create companies, right? Third-party companies. And but it also says, it kind of contradicts, because it says the US can bring basically any third party company operator to help them operate this, but only in accordance with their Armenian partners, counterparts. So, I mean, it's kind of contradicting, because the US can create this, or they can sign contracts, but it has to be in agreement with the Armenian government. And now, I think the most interested parties here would be, Israeli companies, Turkish, Azeri companies, to be inside Armenia, right on Iran's border. I mean, it's for the geopolitical, for their long term. So I think having what we've seen in Pashinyan's government is a government that's not really pursuing national interests in this sense. It's just ceding one after another. In this sense, the Strong Armenia Party would not agree to something like that. Obviously, they would renegotiate with the US and say, not the Israeli, not the Turkish, not the Azeri company, but let's bring, a Romanian company. Let's bring an Indian company or a UAE, So that's
Well, that
something
certainly makes
that's
sense, because if you talk about Azerbaijan and Turkey as guarantors of security, there's a clear conflict of interest, because they're guaranteeing their own benefits. So
yeah,
where's Armenia's benefit in that? There's not a
yeah.
neutral party that's providing the security guarantee.
Yeah, Armenia's weak. From this weak position, it can't do much. I mean, against the US, on top of that, here's Armenia, here's the US. There's also comparison in terms of strength and everything. So, it's and there's not much, very lots of people in the south as well. In Mehri, for example, I know this personally. They don't know what's going on. There's nothing that's really been implemented on the ground. It's still, on paper they don't know how it's going to work out. Is it going to go through Agarak, the town there, or is it going to go through this area? People are completely blind, like in this sense that they have no idea what's
Right.
going to go on. They haven't been informed. So,
Mikael, in your presentations, you've advocated for moving away from emotional reactions, resentment, towards sober judgment and cold calculations. We want to know exactly how you would translate some of these thoughts into foreign policy and policy strategy. For example, if Strong Armenia were to come to power, what are the kinds of policies that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would have to adopt so that you move in this direction?
yeah, first of all, I think there's a lot of work ethic in this as well. Be dedication, lots of dedication, lots of work ethic, and constantly keeping um, Armenia's national interests, on top of everything. You're doing it for this. Keep that in front of you. I do a lot of open source intelligence reports, and for that as well, I do that cold-heartedly. I'm going to bring an example of investigations I do, how I do that to kind of relate it to this. Now, let's say, you have a client tells me to do a person of interest report. I used to do this a lot in LA with a company there. A client calls and says, "Hey, this person with this name and this telephone number, he called us. He threatened to shoot us, so to put an explosive device, etc. Can you find this guy on social media? See if he's dangerous or not. What he posts." So yeah, I would take the telephone number, I take the name, whatever, and cold-heartedly, without assuming anything beforehand, you draw out a plan. You first use, for example, use the intelligence cycle. What do I need to find? What's my objective right there? In foreign policy, what do I need to reach? In investigation, what question does a client want me to answer? The client wants me to see if he's dangerous or not, or if he's a threat or not. And then you go into planification, methodology, where you're going to get this information. Now I'm kind of talking on the investigation side, but you do it cold-heartedly. You don't assume because a guy called all of a sudden, this guy is dangerous. Maybe it's just, a mentally unstable individual that called, but he may be the softest person. So don't assume things, be cold-hearted. In terms of foreign policy, you have to do the same. And something that I would always suggest is be open, always be open, use network and network yourself. Open up to people, speak with people everywhere you go, make a broad network of contacts, of friends. That's something that the Ministry of Exteriors, the MFA could do. Broaden, for example, their reach to local Armenians, not only Armenians, but local organizations, pressure groups, or any type of local actor in the different countries where the embassies are. That will help kind of, bring in
So,
information and reach.
so how would the Strong Armenia-led government deal with the rights of Artsakh Armenians? This is an important issue. Also, we have a war going on to the south in Iran, especially if that war heats up and starts engulfing Azerbaijan and Turkey on Iran's northern borders. How would Strong Armenia react to these events?
Okay, Strong Armenia's position on this, and again, I'm not speaking on actually Strong Armenia for Strong Armenia on behalf of Strong Armenia because I'm an independent advisor, but from what we've seen is basically one of the main things you can see is institutionalized discrimination against Karabakhi Armenians or Artsakhi Armenians. There's a lot of that in the government here. I know a lot of people, from NK as well, and personally. Very few of them are working in government. All the military, for example, a lot of men in Artsakh, they were in the military there, and they came here to Armenia instead of joining the military. They didn't join the military. they weren't let in, or they weren't given good conditions, or this and that. And they, a lot of them, either they're driving taxis or working as security guards.
I mean, some of
Or
them are the most hardened soldiers who have direct fighting experience, tens of thousands, or I mean, at least
yeah.
10,000, let's say. And that's the same thing I have heard.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think one thing that the Strong Armenia Party would do was end this institutionalized discrimination. First of all, things like banning the word Artsakh. I mean, that's just wild. I never even thought I'd be hearing something like that from an Armenian leader. Things like that. Second of all, uh, it's, as I mentioned previously, the party itself is working with what it's going to be inheriting. So it's going to be inheriting this whole jumble, this all these challenges, and obviously, going straight back there is wishful thinking right now, because there's no security guarantees for any Armenians in Azerbaijan. So you see that there are lots of initiatives still. There are still initiatives of Artsakh Armenians in Europe, mainly in Europe, but you have them sometimes in the US, or a few other different countries. But I think it's mainly in Europe that it's more active. In the Swiss, for example, Switzerland as well, kind of like a government in exile. So I think they can partner up. If they see people from the outside countries actually talking about this, they'd be able to cooperate with them, collaborate with them as well, and kind of bring it back to the international agenda, and not just say, it's completely closed. We're not going to talk about this, because, internationally speaking, they have their rights as well. And if, we're abiding by international law on one side, you can't just ignore, Karabakh Armenian, rights as well. So I think the party in general, they're not they're ruling out. I think they're ruling out basically closing the chapter. That's for one thing. They want to incorporate Artsakhis as well in Armenian society, and perfectly, they're citizens as well. They want to give them opportunities, and I think Samuel Karapetyan, he's been doing this for a while. He's actually been in several thousand families, I think he's supporting right now. It might have gone down a bit because some of them, maybe they left the country, but he's helped thousands of Artsakhi families with housing, with all types of costs and everything. So I think giving them an opportunity to work would also help.
I'm very interested in seeing what a new government will do about this, because obviously I want to make sure that, let's say, a strong Armenia-led government does not think that standing up for the rights of Artsakh Armenians is too emotional, or you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's the
Um,
case in this sense. I don't think that's the case, because you also have someone that's the prime minister, or Sami Karapetyan, when he becomes prime minister, he has a big network of people as well, all around the
mhm.
world, and he knows how to negotiate as well. And as I mentioned before, having a big network of people always helps. When you network with
Absolutely.
people, you
We were
always,
talking about
yeah,
150,000 people who became homeless in the last 5 years. So,
yeah,
it's not too emotional to say that these people have rights and they need homes. That's to me,
yeah,
that's not emotional. That's a sober judgment.
yeah.
I mean, that's all I think right, but I want to actually push you a little bit on this. Aliyev is basically mentioning that any assertion of rights of Artsaksis, even saying that, hey, that church that you destroyed, that was made for this, 1,000-year-old community in Stepanakert, that's kind of wrong. Don't do that. If you say that, Pashinyan says it is perceived as an act of aggression. It will bring war. So in an environment where you have threats like that, and both Aliyev is threatening and Pashinyan is reinforcing that, what does sober judgment mean? I just don't know how to. If we say that yes, Azerbaijan is strong, and Azerbaijan is making that as its red line, it's saying that you have no right to even talk about this. How can a new government change that or challenge that?
Several ways. One thing is having red lines. That's the basic. You have red lines, you're not going to cross those red lines. Second is through alliances. As of right now, for example, I'm just talking as from historic examples, any countries trying to kind of bring themselves back from a big disaster, military-wise, it's always difficult because it requires time and lots of money and organization. But having good allies is a bit quicker to get. One of the ways Armenia can do that is creating different work groups in different countries, ad hoc groups specifically dedicated to, shuttle diplomacy between US and Russia, or, Iran or China, or, different powers, regional world powers, to bring them together and say, hey, you guys have overlapping interests in this region. For example, Russia, you have capital here, you have a military presence. US, you have a big embassy here, you have a huge diaspora, lots of Armenians, etc., etc. Different, you guys have overlapping interests in that. You guys all want stability. Let's work together. I'll bring you guys, maybe at a low, not at a ministerial level, something lower than that. A vice, not even a vice minister, maybe even lower than that. You bring together these groups, say, hey, let's work together. Let's find what you want. Let's see if we can secure some security for Armenia. That's another way. I think the quickest way would be finding allies like that. Not allies, but finding good partners that are ready to act as deterrence, persuading or dissuading a country like Azerbaijan that they shouldn't attack Armenia because the costs are gonna outweigh the benefits of it. Second, any country as well, normally if someone sees you as weak, they're going to pick on you. As much as someone may be weak, but they're gonna pick on you. So you have to eventually stand up for yourself, and I think that's what Armenia needs to do. Needs not to be afraid. It needs to rebuild itself through allies and militarily reorganize itself. But it just needs to put in red lines and say, hey, this is it. We're not going that far. I think in Pashinyan's case, he's literally collaborating with Turkey and Azerbaijan. And I think he kind of went visa shopping. As I'm an ex-consular officer, so I always have the visa shopping concept. Visa shopping is when one person's denied a visa in one consulate, they go to a different consulate, a different one, and try their luck, see if they're approved there. Well, I think Pashinyan basically did, in my opinion, did support shopping to Russia, US, Iran, China, this and that, EU, and he eventually found support from Azerbaijan and Turkey. I think he was always kind of inclined to their objectives as well, but I think he found support in them, and the EU jumped on board as as a means of using Armenia as leverage against Russia in the whole context of the Ukraine, the confrontation with Russia. So I think what we see right now is just literally just collaborating with Turkey and Azerbaijan, countries that have shown on numerous occasions they want to destroy you. Turkey may be a lot softer, after the 1915 genocide to 23 genocide, but Azerbaijan, clearly a proxy of Turkey, has not shown disinterest in that.
Mikael, I think you used that term visa shopping figuratively, but I think God willing, if June 7 he's out, I think you literally will have visas from both Turkey and Azerbaijan, and maybe even a private plane to take him there. But that's my.
I don't think they'll need visas for that.
Mikael, let's turn to a final section. What's going on right now, as you were mentioning about the EU leaders and stuff like that, they're all in Armenia for the EPC meeting, the European Community, European Political Community meeting. In his speech, Macron, I think, mentioned indirectly that Armenia's value to the EU is really not in its statehood, but it's in its ability to disconnect from Russia and act as a nuisance for the EU to Russia.
Can I elaborate? He
ahead,
basically said that all of these EU leaders are in Armenia now, and they weren't in Armenia 8 years ago, because 8 years ago Armenia was perceived as a Russian satellite. Now Armenia is not a Russian satellite, so all these wonderful European leaders who brought the war in Ukraine, are now visiting Armenia.
In a diplomatic world, every country is going to be useful for us. I was joking on Groong a month back when Armenia established diplomatic relations or strategic relations with Zimbabwe. I've been thinking that that's well, whatever. Uh, is the EU, what is the importance of the EU here? I think it's 450 million people with a huge GDP and tons of money. But can the EU be a security guarantor and security partner for Armenia from that far away when the enemy countries are on the eastern border and the western border?
In this sense, I think I agree with Macron that the EU really doesn't care much about Armenian statehood. I'll be honest with you. It's always good to have, EU has, it's a really good partner for cultural collaboration, going to universities there and everything and other things. But I think I agree with Macron on this, that they don't really look at the statehood of Armenia, because where were they in 2020? Where were they in 2023? Where were they, where are they right now, where you have over 100 people
Well,
that have been jailed on trumped up charges?
Mhm.
Priests, you have women. The other day they arrested one of our colleagues at the party members, Gohar Humashian. She has a 40-day a newborn baby. And they arrested her, I think, for a day or two, and they released
That's
her.
right.
But where are they right now? Do they? I mean, they know. I'm sure they know. But the thing is, I have to kind of speak about Ukraine here because I honestly think it fits in this context. The conflict in Ukraine, for Europe, it's not going as planned. I mean, Russia's slowly advancing. It's obviously slow, but I think for Russia, it's more of a strategy of attrition as opposed to, just jumping in there, throwing all the troops you can get and high casualties. I think Russia wants to keep a sustained conflict, sustained military operations, and the way to do that is to go slow through attrition as opposed to, using all your force and in energy. So in that sense, I think the EU is unable to confront, all those countries helping the Ukraine. They're unable to really change the situation on the battlefield because Russia's still slowly advancing. And with Mr. Donald Trump's coming of election, he's turned himself kind of away from the EU. He doesn't seem very in favor of supporting the Europeans. And so I think the Europeans are looking at another avenue to get at Russia. And I think Armenia, look, they lost Georgia through elections a couple of years ago after years of trying the same thing, bringing a pro-EU individual to Georgia, Saakashvili, for example. And after him as well, there's a persecution of the church, of the Georgian church, kind of similar to what's happening here in Armenia as well. And Georgia eventually, they turned the other way. They said, no, we live, I think they honestly said, we live in the Caucasus, we live in this region, we can't go against Russia. All of our trade comes from Russia. It's not that we're necessarily pro-Russian or et cetera, but we're neighbors with Russia, we're neighbors with Iran, with Azerbaijan, with this and that. We have to stay in our neighborhood. And EU is too far away to be able to come to our rescue, or it's too costly for us. I think they eventually lost, the EU lost Georgia. And to get back at Russia in a way, I think they're looking at Armenia, and they look at Armenia as leverage against Russia. Leverage in the sense of eventually removing, having Russia withdraw its two military bases. And one thing also I want to mention. It was the EU joint declaration, something very, very important here. They signed it. What's today? The 5th. They issued it today, a joint declaration where, EU joint declaration with Armenia, big pompous words, lots of nice sounding phrases, integration, trans-European, etc., growth. There's one part of there that said the EU and Armenia are looking to decommission the nuclear power plant in Armenia. They're working on a plan to decommission it. Do you guys know how many percentage of energy comes from that? It's around 30%.
Yeah.
Armenia gets about 30% of its energy from that nuclear power plant. And who actually supplies the nuclear material, who maintains it? It's Rosatom. It's a big Russian company, very big Russian company. And I think that kind of that thing, that clause found its way in the joint declaration strictly because, it's reflecting the EU stance on Russia and what they want to use Armenia for. They're pushing for Armenia to open up borders with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Look, it's always good to have good relations with your neighbors, but you have to think about your national security and you have to think about national interests as well, not just open it up. But I think as the EU is also pushing, and they mentioned that in a joint statement, they're pushing for Armenia to open up as soon as possible the borders with Turkey, because as soon as they open up the borders with Turkey, the Russian military bases are no longer going to be needed because there's no security threat. Mr. Pashinyan's going to say, Russia, you have to withdraw your military bases. Sorry, we don't need them anymore. Just like, Saakashvili did in 2004, 2005. And the thing in Armenia is this is the last Russian military presence in the region. So, I mean, symbolically and strategically for Russia, it'll be a big loss. They've been here for a couple hundred years, and it's
Mikael, the whole situation is like fractals. The more you dig into it, the more details become evident. I think we're going to have to leave it there, even though, as you brought up, the issue of Georgia and the EU losing Georgia, that is a very interesting topic, but maybe we'll leave it for our next discussion. I still don't understand how Armenia can be part of the EU with Georgia, as the EU calls it, with Georgia being in the Russian sphere, which by the way, I would dispute, but still. Anyway,
and we
thank you so much.
we didn't even drill into the Iran war that much, so we should definitely talk again, Mikael.
Very soon.
I'm happy to do that. I'm monitoring it on a daily basis as well, so I'm curious of what's going to happen.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us and your insight. We'll talk again.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you guys for the time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You.
That's our show today. This episode was recorded on May 5, Cinco de Mayo, 2026. We've been talking with Mikael Darbinian, who is a political scientist and former U.S. diplomat, having served at the U.S. embassies in Argentina and Russia as vice consul. He is the founder of Security Observer, Expert Voices from the Global South. He graduated from Madrid's Complutense University, having lived and worked in 8 countries. Darbinian is currently, 2026, a private security consultant for the Strong Armenia party with Samvel Garabedian.
Thank you, folks, for joining us. Just a quick reminder to like, comment, share, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Thank you very much. I'm Havik Manoucharyan.
I'm Asbet Bedrosyan. We'll talk to you soon.